Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking members, and distinguished members of the committee. I am the 10th Secretary and the CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, and I say that I am delighted to hear Dr. Zimmerman's celebration of the liberal arts and sciences. Phi Beta Kappa was founded, like our nation, in 1776, and dedicated to the notion of free expression, free inquiry, and that the liberal arts and sciences would bring us to a better place. Indeed, it has in this country. I am honored today to appear on behalf of the Anti-Defamation League, of which I am a national commissioner and former chair of the National Legal Affairs Committee. The challenge of free expression on our campuses has never seemed greater, and I am grateful for the opportunity to address it today before this committee. I know from my years as a law school dean and as a university president that these challenges come in all directions and all contexts. They come from the left and they come from the right.
Mr. Lawrence, just pull the mic a little closer. Pull your mic a little closer to you there. Yeah, we're talking.
Did you miss any of the good stuff, Mr. Chairman?
Got it all. Got it all. Keep going, brother.
I want to make sure that my board heard everything, Mr. Chairman. The challenges of free speech come from the left and they come from the right. They involve students, they involve faculty, and they involve those outside the campus who affect the community as invited speakers and sometimes as uninvited agitators. Given our current polarization in our society, it is perhaps no surprise that this issue presents itself with such urgency on our campuses today. Public campuses and private, small liberal arts schools and large research universities. At this moment, it is especially important to clarify first principles pertaining to our democracy's core values of free expression as they manifest themselves on our campus, and I would articulate two such principles. First, and I think there is broad agreement in this panel today on this, robust free expression and free inquiry are central for the mission of our colleges and universities. The limits of such expression are way out on the margins of expressive activity, and they involve behavior that threatens or instills fear in a victim or victims. Hate speech is protected. Hate crimes are not. The second principle is that constitutionally protected hate speech still causes harm to members of our community. There is a moral imperative, therefore, for campus leaders vigorously to criticize hate speech, not to suppress it, not to prohibit it, but to identify it for what it is and to criticize it. These two principles lead me to a third conclusion, that efforts to legislate bright-line solutions to subtle and complex situations are misguided and they are doomed to fail. Campus administrators must be given the discretion to handle cases of hate speech and to judge when cases have crossed the line into hate crimes. If we are to do our job, as Congresswoman Fox said, to teach our students how to think, that must be left in the hands of those on campus who are best equipped to make those decisions. Let me elaborate briefly on the two principles. Free expression is a core value of our system of government and our society, and it is especially true on our campuses. Most, if not all, of our campuses share a common mission to discover and create knowledge and to transmit that knowledge through our teaching and our scholarship. For this mission, free expression and free inquiry are essential. I therefore start from the presumption that speech on campus and writings on campus are protected, but this is not a presumption without a limit. Where should the limit for expression be? Where does protected hateful speech cross over into being behavior that a university may prohibit and sanction? As is so often the case in the law, for example, in basic principles of criminal law, we do best to focus on the actor's intent. The division between that which we may protect and that which we may prohibit should be based on the intent of the actor. Is the intent to communicate, however hateful the idea, or is the intent to intimidate and threaten a particular victim? A recent example that helps make this point, referred to by Ranking Member Dennings, and that refers to the statement of Ms. Taylor Dumpson, seated behind me in the room today, makes the point. As the ranking member said, after her election as the first black woman to hold the position of president of the student government at American University, she was the victim of targeted, hate-motivated actions, bananas hung with nooses with the letters of an African-American sorority. This reaches beyond the boundaries of free expression to a hate crime and has no place on an American campus. To be sure, not all hateful speech is similarly threatening and prescribable. Much is protected. What is the proper response when hateful speech that is protected occurs on our campuses? Here, I believe, as Professor Strawson said at the very beginning, we do well to look to Justice Louis Brandeis's famous dictum in the case of Whitney against California, where he said the answer to hateful or offensive speech is not enforced silence, it is more speech. And in the face of hate speech on campuses, the call for more speech is not merely an option, it is a moral obligation on behalf of our campus leaders on all sides. We observe with alarm the disturbing increase in the number of cases of white supremacist activity on our campuses, as has been well and disturbingly documented by the Anti-Defamation League. But even then, the answer will generally not be the enforced silence of which Justice Brandeis warned. The answer is to assert the highest values of our academic communities. Doing so precisely in the context of how we debate and how we disagree is at the heart of the enterprise of a college or a university. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And so my question to the administrators, the people who are in the shoes trying to, of the college presidents and administrators who are trying to enforce these principles, Dr. Lawrence and Dr. Zimmerman, I mean, how do you, A, prevent that kind of shouting down and just, shut down of speech, which we saw, and on the other hand, prevent what Ms. Demings, Congresswoman Demings talked about, which is that hate crime, in my view. What are the challenges there, and from a public policy standpoint, like, is there anything that you need in terms of tools to help in that particular area?
Well, let me start with the last question. Is there anything else that we need besides the goodwill of the House of Representatives? We certainly do not need more legislation in this area. I think the question of how do you deal with the conflict between, on the one hand, protecting students from hate crimes, on the other hand, exposing students to troublesome ideas, even offensive ideas, and teaching them how to respond to it. That is the challenge that we meet. But you start, I think, by recognizing as a university administrator that those are not the only two options. Either we protect speech and embrace it, or we prohibit speech. There's this whole middle category that says speech is protected, it is encouraged, and university administrators also have First Amendment rights and also get to speak. And so in many cases, the answer is not to run to the extreme of shutting down an event. If there is even a white supremacist on campus, if they are invited by a campus group or in a state university, if they are entitled to be there by the state university rules, then you don't shut it down, but you do counter it with comments of your own. And the administration has to say, we have values in this university, and we represent all of our students of all backgrounds, and this is what we stand for. And these are the high values of this university. I know outside the context of the university, this sounds like thin stuff. Within the university, on the campus, for those of us who spent our lives there, this is not thin stuff. This is the real stuff. This is where students and faculty are engaged in the life of the school on a daily basis. So this is where Justice Brandeis really did have it right. The answer is not enforced silence, but it is more speech. And more speech is not just an option, it's a moral obligation.
Mr. Lawrence, do you think that when Mr. Shapiro is on campus that he has any intentions to cause violence or promote violence? Do you think he's an agitator, or do you think he engages in hate speech?
No, I have no reason to believe he's there to create violence. And in fact, I would say that the wise university president does not get in the business on a daily basis of calling First Amendment balls and strikes. Generally speaking, you want to let the game play on. You want ideas to be exchanged. Mr. Carolla wants to come to campus and do his seething critique of Taylor Swift. I would say have at it. But those aren't the hard cases that we're talking about. Where you do weigh in are precisely cases.
What do you mean they're not the hard cases? Mr. Shapiro has been shouted down, uninvited, violence at the thing. So what do you mean it's not the hard case? If you think his speech is appropriate, he's engaging in the kind of ideas, robust debate that we want on college campuses, then why is the reaction the way it is then?
There shouldn't be that reaction, and what I mean by not being a hard case is that it should not be a hard case for a university administration to protect his right to speak. I think there's no problem with that.
Yeah, it seems to be.
But what I mean by the hard cases is that when you do see a dramatic increase in white supremacist incidents on campuses, university administrators have to pay attention. And particularly when there are people who come from the outside, and the university president has a hard time keeping control of her or his campus. But that's a different situation from Mr. Carolla
Mr. Shapiro.
Mr. Shapiro.
Mr. Lawrence, in your written testimony, you talk about white supremacists are engaged in unprecedented outreach on American colleges and campuses. What do you believe accounts for the rise in outreach, and what do you believe white supremacist groups are hoping to achieve by the increase in targeting colleges and universities?
I think what they are hoping to accomplish is to influence the next generation of leaders in society, and so they come to campus with that in mind. I think they also are hoping to get a high level of visibility, which they do. Campuses get a high level of attention in the media, in the press, in government, and mostly for good reasons, but I think that raises that as well. And I think to a certain extent we are living in a highly hyper-polarized environment right now, and there is a violence to the vocabulary that comes very quickly, and there is a racialized version of much of this vocabulary that comes very quickly. But let me hasten to add that even when those groups come to campus, I still think the answer is more speech, not to restrict. But I do think this is where the job of the administrator becomes very complicated, but terribly important, to be a voice of clarity, to say, on this campus, we believe that all are entitled to come here and have a satisfying learning experience, to be challenged intellectually, to be troubled with ideas, but not to be threatened and not to be stigmatized because of who they are or what they are.
You know, as I indicated in my opening statement, I have been directly involved in numerous providing security for numerous protests as persons who I agreed with and groups that I didn't exercise their First Amendment rights. So I take this conversation very, very seriously. You talked earlier about kind of the complicated and sometimes difficult job of the college administrator who is trying to balance protecting the right to free speech, but also thinking about the welfare and safety and well-being of their students, which can be a difficult line. Could you, or even Dr. Zimmerman, I'd like to hear from both of you, kind of talk more about, even though we've said it's difficult, could you kind of talk more about the role of the college administrator in balancing the right to free speech and the welfare of the students on campus?
Let me start with something very important that Dr. Zimmerman said. These discussions do not best start once an event has already happened on campus. It starts at first-year orientation discussions. It starts in dinners in the president's home. It starts in discussions in the office talking about what do we stand for? What does a civil learning climate mean? What does it mean to challenge each other? It comes with how we treat each other. I think he's also right that there are a precious few good role models for civil disagreement in our society right now. So we have to create those on our university campuses. When an event does happen, I think there also are very significant rules of engagement that have to be enforced. So for example, if Mr. Shapiro wanted to come to my campus, he obviously would be free to come, and I would make sure that there were no protesters who kept him from coming. But I would require, and I'm sure he'd be happy with this requirement, that he'd have to take questions and answers. He couldn't just give a speech and leave. I have no reason to think he wouldn't agree with that.
In fact, I actually, at all my speeches, I say, if you disagree with me, you go to the front of the line for Q&A. That's always how it works.
When I got pushback, particularly from some of my trustees about certain speakers they disagreed with vehemently, why are they on campus? My response was always, trust my kids. I'm going to make sure that these speakers have to answer questions, and they're going to stay until the questions are done. Trust my students to ask hard questions. That's where the training how to think actually happens. So you create those environments as well. But look, let's be clear as well. When the situation gets out of control, usually because you've got people from the outside, not only, sometimes it's inside, but usually when you've got people from the outside, then you've got the same questions on campuses that law enforcement, such as your experience, are more adept dealing with, and these will continue to be challenges for our universities.
In your written testimony, you also talked about the just unbelievable number of incidents of racist-related stickers, flyers on campuses. Could you talk about a little bit about the impacts that you have seen on certain groups as it pertains to those flyers and stickers?
Look, you've got to go all the way back to first principles. Universities are not punitive institutions, they are educative institutions. We exist for a purpose. It is to educate our students. When there is a pervasive expression of racism on campus, that disables the learning of certain students. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean you would repress some of that expression, but you have to respond to that. not just because you think that's a nice thing to do. You have a professional obligation as an educator to see to the learning ability of the students on your campus. So the incidents that you're referring to have a deeply negative impact on the ability of students to learn, which at the end of the day is the mission of the institution.
I just want to bring up something from your written testimony that, frankly, Mr. Lawrence, I find troubling. You cite an instance at Central Michigan University where there was a Valentine's Day card that went out that was extremely offensive to Jews. And you do point out that the creator, and it was attributed to a Republican student group. And in your written testimony, you point out that the creator of the Valentine turned out to not be a student. But you never disengage, you never mention in here that it was not the Republican group, that an inquiry into this by Central Michigan University found, led by Catherine Lasher, said that they determined the leaders of the student organization, the college Republicans at CMU, were unaware of the card, and that their director said the members of the student organization were shocked and remorseful. Why didn't you make that clear?
Congressman, I apologize if it was not clear in the written testimony as you see it. I did say in the testimony that it was determined not to be from a student group.
But you didn't make clear that it wasn't the Republican, not only was not a student, it wasn't the Republicans. I guess I'm a little sensitive about that, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to enter this into the record, if I may.
Without objection.
Because I realize that some speech does incite inappropriate behavior, even violence. And I know that firsthand because I was one of the Republican baseball players that was on the field. I was 20 steps from the guy when he started shooting, and it was clear that he was incited by certain speech. But I'd like to point out that as traumatic as that experience was, I have not heard a single demand from any one of those who were present, who were injured or wounded, for restriction of anyone's right to speak their views on any issue. And I just think, I was at the University of Alabama in the mid-1970s. 1965 was the first time an African-American was allowed to enroll in the university. It was a dark time in our history. There's no question about it. But in 1976, we elected the first African-American president of the Student Government Association. The year before that, the executive vice president of the Student Government Association. And there were people who disagreed and protested, but we didn't have this inability to communicate that we have right now on university campuses.
Mr. Chairman, I would agree that it is critically important that on campuses we not get in the business of name-calling and certainly not prohibiting others from speaking. And in fact, one of the reasons that I think it is very important for universities not to rush to judgment and not to look at these as cases to punish but as cases to educate is that the goal at the end of the day is to teach students how to challenge each other intellectually, but not physically and not with words.
You have a responsibility, though, to make sure that both sides have the opportunity to engage. This idea that denying students the opportunity to hear views or ideas that are contrary to what they believe, these safe spaces, I think are dangerous. You're not protecting students. You're denying them the ability to engage in debate, to defend their views or oppose other views, because when they leave college, I promise you, they're going to run into views that are opposite to their own.
You and I are in complete agreement on that. It is the obligation of a university to expose students to views they disagree with. You and I are in complete agreement on that point.
I remember my very first day on campus. I grew up in a rural town in Kentucky, 1,500 people, and I went to a school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'd never even visited the campus. I crossed the crosswalk. We didn't have any crosswalks where I grew up, and a car honked at me. I thought, what are the odds? I've been here an hour and already met somebody I know. I turned around and waved at the car. I think they were waving back with one finger, but what that showed me is these people may have different ideas or a different upbringing than I had. Ms. Strawson articulated a threshold for reasonable expectation of whether something is hate speech or whether it's protected or not. Mr. Lawrence, she said it would, maybe the threshold should be reasonable expectation that it would instill fear of violence or harm. Would you like to, in less than 30 seconds, if you could, sort of articulate the standard of what might be protected and what might not?
Yeah, I think that, Professor Strassen and I are in roughly the same place on this. I would just focus more, as we often do in the criminal law, on the intent of the actor. So was it behavior that was intended to threaten or intimidate? Not to confound, not to trouble, not to raise new opinions,
Right.
but to threaten or to intimidate.
Okay. I've got a document here you may recognize. It's the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. If I brandish this, Mr. Lawrence, in your presence, are you intimidated? Does it strike fear in your heart? Do you think that harm may come to you very soon?
I think it is actually much safer than crossing the street in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
I would agree.
It's interesting, one of your colleagues said a little earlier that actually there's very good working relationships across the aisle here. We don't see it out in public, and I think that's exactly the same phenomenon we're talking about in the university. There's a lot of things that happen in the classroom and office hours and seminar rooms that don't get a lot of play, because if it bleeds, it leads, is the way the media treats you and also treats us in academia. As the CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, I would be remiss if I did not thank you for your deep embracement of the liberal arts. Phi Beta Kappa stands for Philosophia Bio Kubernetes, which means love of learning is the guide of life. I mention that, Congressman, because it's about the process of the learning, which I think is key. And when we lose track of that, then I think we get ourselves in problems. But the great legal philosopher Alexander Bickel said, the only true integrity is the integrity of process. And the process by which we learn in our universities, which is really what we're here talking about today, is what is the glory of our university system in this country.
Mr. Lawrence, are you familiar with the hate speech incidents that I just described?
Yes, I am.
And is that an example of hate speech that crosses the line and should have no place on a college campus?
That is correct, Congresswoman. I would say that's actually, what I usually mean by hate speech or hateful speech is the kind of speech that is in fact protected and ought to be criticized by university administrators. I would say what happened to Ms. Dumpson crosses the line actually over to being a hate crime.
Why is that?
Because of the clear intent of the actor is not to communicate a view, but to threaten her, to intimidate her, to instill fear in her. When that happens, we're no longer in the realm of having a even difficult, provocative conversation. We've crossed over the line into threats.
So it's as Ms. Strassen discussed, that a reasonable person would see that as threatening speech, not as one that is merely to express an opinion that may be different.
That is certainly how I would understand it. And there'd be a model speech code that everybody will agree on. I guess that's an easy one. The answer almost certainly is no. Can we make an effort in that direction? I think the answer there is yes. And it will look something like this. A overwhelmingly strong presumption in favor of protection of free speech, certainly on campuses of all kinds for all comers who belong on those campuses. That's principle number one. Principle number two, there's a limiting principle that is the kind of thing that Professor Strassen and I have been talking about, where you actually have an intent to do harm, to threaten, to intimidate, not to confound, not to trouble, but to actually literally do harm. And then principle number three is that what is the obligation of a university, even in the realm of protected speech, when it is hateful speech? I think those three principles in some form or another are going to form the model of the kind of speech codes that you'll get the broadest consensus that you can. The more specific you try to be about this is in and this is out, you're going to start making mistakes, and that's why virtually every university speech code has been struck down by courts.